Hi everyone, I'm Patrick O'Mahony, Creative Director and founder at NEWSUBSTANCE, the studio behind SeaMonster.
I'm Antonia Gammans, Head of Marketing and Partnerships for the project.
So SeaMonster, I think this sums up really, it was, wow, yeah, it was harder than we expected on every possible level. Most shows we've done in the past, there's always that moment in there where you have to overcome adversity. On SeaMonster, I think it was every month there was something new. The process we went through, I think we had that wonderful naivety at the very start of the project. We had this idea, everyone was behind us, and we thought it was possible. It was, but what we went through to get there was just insane along the way. And today, I suppose we're going to take you through that journey for the first time, explain what we went through, what happened, and how we get to where we are now, opening that process. But kind of back in October, we first set about finding these wonderful people. This was our original team, the people who originally got behind the idea and said, yes, let's do this. We had Dr. Amelie, Dr. Ella, they were our climate scientists from the British Antarctic Survey, mad about clouds and our kind of through line in terms of sustainability on the project. We had Dosa Society, Nia and Ahmed. They were the people that first called it. They said literally in December in 2020, you're going to go to Weston-super-Mare. We didn't believe them to start with. We'd send them all around the country, looking at multiple sites, and where do we end up? We ended up in Weston-super-Mare. Vanita and Natasha, they led our education and outreach program from the very beginning, really big advocates in that space. And then Ivan, kinetic sculptor, and Amit Patel, who was an amazing, amazing kind of driver for us in terms of accessible design throughout the whole process from the very, very beginning. And I suppose we started, you know, like everyone did in this process, over Zoom, trying to kind of grapple with the creativity of what we wanted to do. We didn't have a standout idea from the very beginning. We had lots of threads of stories. We wanted to do a project on reuse. That was literally one of the first cornerstones to the entire SeaMonster. We wanted to take something that existed. We're so obsessed with kind of ripping down our past. We wanted to find something that we could celebrate and reuse in that process. Renewable futures, I suppose, especially from Ella and Amelie's point of view, we wanted to look forward in that process, not look backwards. And this became a really, really important factor. And I'll explain it later when we get to the rig itself, how this kind of ramped up in terms of looking at that intersection between art and design and renewables. And the Great British Weather, like this was like almost, it was like the real sense of humor to the project. You know, what does it mean, the Great British Weather? It's part of our cultural identity. It's kind of part of who we are. We complain about it. We celebrate it. When you go anywhere, you always talk about the weather. And that's, in effect, why we also went to a seaside town. What is more quintessential than the Great British Weather, than a British seaside town? So, how do we end up with one of these? So, we came across it. We had our stories, but we had no platform. We had no sense of scale. We had no sense of awe for our project. We had these storylines. And we're getting to the point where, as the kind of lead studio, we're quite worried about how to frame this. And then by pure chance, we came across the graveyards of these rigs. They exist in Scotland. They exist in America, Mexico. And they just sit there. They come out of the sea, and they just sit there. Some are reused. Some are recycled. But they just exist. And we asked that really simple question. what happens if we could get hold of one of these? And I assumed the idea would die pretty quickly because I assumed somebody more important would say no. And the problem was that no one ever said no. And that's how we kind of found ourselves in the position of then getting one. I spoke to Mike, who's our engineer, a man from Yorkshire who's very grumpy on a daily basis. And I said to him, do you think we could get one of these? Do you think we could do it? And whilst he did say, why would you want to do that? He also didn't say no. And that was, I suppose, the green light to go to the next stage. And then we found some guys in Scotland called LOC, L-O-C, and they move rigs for a living. So we thought, right, let's speak to them. We rang them up. And obviously it's one of those kind of daunting phone calls because you're literally going, hi, could we get hold of a rig and would like to make it into an art installation? These are very dour Scottish guys who, there was a bit more swearing, I won't do a Scottish accent, but they were like, why would you want to do that? No one's ever asked to do it before, but I think that was the point. No one had tried to do this before. We soon became aware that we were going to do this for the first time in the world. And they came straight on board, and that was the amazing thing again. Like, they said, no one's done it before, but when she took them through the idea of what we wanted to do and why we wanted to do it, they thought it was a great idea. So we spent our summer going around places like this. This was up in Hartlepool, one of the big decommissioning yards there. This is a 28,000-ton rig. We had a 500-ton rig. So, but in my mind, when we first went there, that would be our rig. Like, it was a totally misalignment of my expectation of what we could do. But these amazing structures, and then you started to talk to people in these yards who spent their life on these rigs, either working on them or decommissioning them. And, you know, when you got past the initial sniggering of what you were going to do, then the excitement came. They wanted to be part of it. They wanted to be our advocates for it. And we thought we'd found one in Hartlepool to start with, and then that didn't work out. We got to wear amazing outfits like this as well. It felt very, very exciting going around these rigs. And spent our summer kind of looking at them, and we thought we had one, and it literally was a roller coaster, and this was the first challenge. We had a rig at one point, and then we lost it again. And trying to find these structures when they're mid-decommissioning cycle, you've got 5-year cycles for these things. So to persuade someone to give you one in the middle of a massive process they're going through was hard. And this is the guy that all our cards were on, basically. He was our chance to find our rig. This is Nick from LOC, and he was the person that actually got us our rig in the end, and this was it. So this is the Sea Monster in the Netherlands before it started to be decommissioned. Amazing kind of moment. We knew it as soon as we saw it that this was the right one for us, and everything started to align. I say it started to align. Antonia's going to take you more into in my head, it was all very easy, and we found this. It looked great, and I knew what we were going to do. In Antonia's world, it was a whole lot harder with a lot of different governmental bodies. But you know, I suppose what we soon became aware of, which we didn't realize necessarily at the start, is that we were going to be first, and going to be first is really hard. There is no rule book. There is no one you can call. There was a lot of people who were like, yes, you should do this. This is a good thing for the industry. But the thing was, then you need those people with you. You need those partners with you. So when it does go wrong, which it did, you've got somebody standing shoulder to shoulder with you. And I think this, for me, really goes to the power of Weston-super-Mare. Like, to be fair, as soon as we spoke to Weston-super-Mare, the council there, we knew we were going to go there. We spoke to lots of different places, but their ambition, their dedication to the project, kind of both locally and on a council level, was absolutely amazing. You know, they really, really wanted it to happen, and we really needed them. You know, at the end of the day, we were going to take a rig, we were going to bring it into Weston, we were going to put it on the beach in its raw form before we even started to transform it. That needed like core grassroots support, and we also had it from the town itself, and we had a roller coaster journey. You know, it didn't arrive, as we all know, when we anticipated it to. But I think having that support and having that partner and having that iconic place like we did on the beach, where we sat almost like a sandcastle in itself right on the front there, was a really, really big factor of why we actually got there in the end. And this was it, I suppose, and this is the kind of next big part of the jeopardy. You know, we put this render out very early in the process, and you're always going to get judged against the render. And I'll now hand over to Antonia to give you a bit more background on what happened in between.
So the fun bit. We thought we'd secured a rig, and we had a location. We thought we sort of had everything in the bag. But very early on, it was made known to us that there were so many different industry authorities that we needed to speak to. We spoke to the Environment Agency, we spoke to OPRED, who are the Offshore Petroleum Regulatory Body for Decommissioning, we spoke to the Oil and Gas Authority, non-profit organisations such as Decom North Sea, who were incredibly helpful and throughout the journey agreed in principle, that they would support us throughout. But none of them could tell us how. They couldn't tell us how to do it, what the rule book was, how to go about the process whatsoever. So having spoken with all of them and very nearly securing the rig, it wasn't until the platform owners said to us, we absolutely need a letter from the Minister of State for Energy and Climate Change, stating that we absolutely must do this, because whilst they themselves and a small proportion of the company wanted to do it, it was a really hard sell-in to their CEOs, to their board members, because this had never been done before. So we went back to Opred, who have been huge supporters of ours. They were the closest link to the minister. They said, listen, we can ask, but we cannot guarantee that they will write a letter to the rig owners. 3 days later, the letter was written, and we secured ourselves a rig. I think Patrick and I might write a book after this about that whole process. So what happened next, again, was not plain sailing by any means. We were told very early on about the decommissioning triangle, where reuse sits at the top, followed by recycling and then dismantlement and disposal. So within the oil and gas industry, reuse sits at the very, very top. But the more and more people we spoke to, the more we got told that whilst reuse sits at the top and it's something they want to explore more and more, it's when the creative minds come together with those industries that can really happen, and it just hadn't happened before. So it comes back to that cornerstone of what UNBOXED stands for. What happens when the world of science, technology, engineering and maths meets the world of art and design? And that's where the magic happens. That's where Sea Monster happens. And it's not until those worlds collide that we can do something like this. So the big question, another hurdle we came across, was when the platform is waste and when it becomes product. So we were given an inventory by the Environment Agency very, very early on in the process, which explained the way in which the platform needed to be cleaned to be removed of any hazardous materials and could be deemed as product and still work in order to be shipped internationally. So we did all of the cleaning. We spoke with the decommissioning yard every day within the Netherlands, which is where the platform was being decommissioned, who explained to us that once it was all cleaned, it would be deemed as product and therefore could be transported very easily across international waters. So it wasn't until months later that we really started interrogating it, asking more and more to people within the industry, including the Environment Agency, who said to us, no, it's still waste. No matter if you clean it and it still work, it will still be waste. So with every country disagreeing with each other and the fact that we had a finite amount of time to ship it because of the tides, we pushed and pushed, and it took a couple of months for those in the Netherlands, those in the UK to actually speak and align on what it was. We didn't mind which it would be, we just needed to know, because it ended up being that they deemed it as waste and came back to us after having very lengthy conversations about what it should be deemed as, which then meant that we had the fun of having to raise a Transfrontier Waste Permit, a local enforcement plan, and tons of other documents. So again, we were told what we needed to do, but none of us had written a permit to get a rig over to the UK before. So for the first time in history, the Environment Agency allowed us to reopen the permit of the platform as it currently stood and resubmit it with its new intended use. So we worked really hard with UNBOXED, with the platform owners, to resubmit a 500-page new permit to get the platform over to the UK. And what was really interesting is, although it was deemed as waste, they said that when we would open the exhibit as Sea Monster, it could change its status to product. But when we closed the doors, it became waste again. Make of that what you will, but it's very, very clear that that was an interim position from all of those authorities. And what was so crazy to us and the biggest challenge is that no one had addressed that before, and reuse sits at the top of that triangle, but had never been explored, and there is no blueprint for this. So we were navigating moving and transforming Sea Monster without following a path that had ever been done. So it was rocky, to say the least, and it was through pure determination on NEWSUBSTANCE, all of our partners, Unboxed, to really push this forward. There's still no rule book for doing this. There's still no blueprint. And even when we resubmitted the permits, we were told by the Environment Agency and other authorities that we could submit the permits if we wanted, but this was not going to happen this year. But we still fought. It needed to happen this year. It needed to happen on a very specific window, which I'll go on to next. So arrival was a whole other piece of work as well. So alongside dealing with all of the permit side of things, the arrival was just a huge feat of engineering. We were originally going to transport it on trucks. It was what we knew, it was safe zone, but we were told by our partners in the Netherlands that it should move by water. That made sense economically, in a kind of sustainable sense as well. So we proceeded to investigate the moving of it by water, which is what we did. We got the permits less than 24 hours before it moved on water, and we had one window a month because of the tides. Weston has the second largest tidal range in the world, so we were dealing with that as well. It moved on a barge the size of a football pitch. It came up to the beach in Weston-super-Mare. We waited for it to be beached, and then there are these huge SPMTs, self-propelled modular transporters, that move up the beach, connect to the barge. Then the platform is moved over. It's then moved up the beach, which is hands down the most insane thing I think any of us have ever seen. And then we waited for the winds to die down, and on one of the cranes, using one of the cranes, the biggest in the UK, we moved it over the wall of the Tropicana. And we've just got a little video that summarizes what those 6 days looked like.
So by that point, everyone is destroyed. So, that was enough just to get it into the country. In fact, we'd done that, and that whole arrival piece, when you speak to Mahmoud, who move these things all around the world all the time, and they said, we've never done anything like it. It's the hardest job we've ever done in terms of beach landing, crane lifts, everything else. So that always is cause for concern. But by that point, we'd only just got to the end of almost chapter 2. We now actually had to do what we said we were going to do. We had to then build it, finish it, and open it. But the team was already pretty stretched, as you can imagine, by this point. And, we kind of go back to the render as well. People, it only came out afterwards, people already started saying you're never going to get the rig in. It's got the highest tidal cycle. You're never going to lift it. The rumor mill starts to come pretty hard and fast, especially when you're perceived as being late. But we always said that the thing with Sea Monster, it wasn't about our opening moment. It was about that sense of spectacle. And I think the arrival piece was that, the biggest piece of industrial theatre that I've ever been part of, that sense of scale. And I think it brought together, for me, that entire cross-sector collaboration. It needed everyone to be fully on board to achieve what we did in the time that we did. But, we always held against this. And this is 2 weeks before we open. We're pretty close to the render by that point. And by this point, we're pretty much there. And I suppose that's when it started to turn. We had a tough run in terms of that locality. We put all our eggs in one basket. We said we're coming to Weston. But like I said, we started with the arrival piece, that big moment. We then went into our awakening program. We brought a big drone show down there. We had 60,000 people over 3 days come to see that. And I suppose it started to lead towards the moment when we were finally open. And this is it. So, you know, from as you come into the Sea Monster, you first come behind the waterfall. The waterfall has always been in our original design. It's the roar of our monster. It has that signature note, and you come behind it and you come up the main set of stairs there. You then come onto the first floor where we've got our cloud portal. This again is Amelie and Ella, kind of total cloud nerds. They were like, you have to make clouds on the rig. So we did, but also making sure we had that sense of play and enjoyment. We were always making sure that we put a smile on people's faces. We wanted to be a forward-looking program in terms of how we designed it. And that's it there. And it's different every day depending on how the wind moves, and the wind sure moves a lot in Western, as we found out. It's different every time you go in there. The walkway, I suppose, was a really kind of big factor for me in terms of how we designed the project. You know, every part of the technical team and the fabrication team tried to cut this at every possible moment in the project. It's too complicated, it's too expensive, let's just put a scaffolding stair core in there. But the whole point of this is that journey to somewhere is as important as that final destination. You know, moving people up the rig to height, they get to see Western from different vantage points, to get to see the sea, and we purposely separate it from the whole rig itself, so it stood off from it, so you get that distance to look back at the structure itself as you move up around it. And then finally in the garden at the top, the whole point was, you know, the rig has spent its life kind of taking out of the earth, and it was this opportunity to give back. It's part of its rehabilitation, and planting this wild garden up there totally managed to rethink how it felt and what its purpose was. These are the renewable energies. As mentioned at the very beginning, we worked for a long time with a consultant on this side of it, and we sent them the brief of bringing new thinking. What happens when art and design starts to intersect these two technologies? We wanted to do something new. We knew there were very efficient ways of creating renewable energy, but we wanted to see what happens when art and design gets involved. And after a very protracted period with them, they came back with a report, and their suggestion was to stick a white wind turbine on there and big sheet solar pieces. I was like, that is just not, you've totally missed the point here. And we then ended up into a bit of a heated discussion, and the lead consultant said to me, he said, the problem is when artists get involved is that it becomes too expensive and it becomes impractical. And his example to this was a chair. He said, when an artist designs a chair, it becomes uncomfortable and expensive. So at that point, we consciously uncoupled from our expensive consultants and went in a very different direction, because he really annoyed us that day. And we worked with Laggy instead. So we worked with Land Art Generator, some amazing people out the States, out of Burning Man. Their mindset was totally different. They've been running sustainable design competitions for 20 years, and they brought a whole different kind of, a total different mindset to the whole project. They brought Trevor Lee, who's been trying to make the wind nest for the past 6 years. It got kiboshed during COVID. A whole new way of thinking. They worked with us on the solar design for the solar tree there, which is out of the Dubai Expo. Their entire thinking, their entire approach, their education was amazing. And yes, whilst they aren't as efficient as the standard approach, this was the whole point, is to provoke the conversation. Could these be part of placemaking in cities? You know, our solar and our wind powers the entire of the garden, all the irrigation system. And it's that, I suppose, we wanted to make sure that when people went around it, they took notice of it. They walked around their sculptural interventions in themselves, and it became a much, much bigger part of the process as we started to battle against the existing paradigm of what it should look like. The slide, everyone loves a slide, and I suppose it goes to our core values of making sure the rig had that sense of joy and play around it, and it's very fast and very scary at the same time. And the helideck, and I think the helideck's really interesting in the sense that everyone thought it was going to be the wildest place on the whole rig, not in a party sense, but in a weather sense. We thought it would be really windy up there. We put the amphitheatre up there with the hope it gave so many people to rest after they'd been up the whole structure. It's weirdly the calmest place on the whole place. It's where we now have much more performance. It's where everybody wants to get to. It's like, it's the summit of our entire structure. But I think that's what's interesting about projects like this and structures like the Sea Monster. We had preconceived ideas of where the hero shots would be, where the key points of interest would be, how people would interact with it. When we built it, it was totally different. Those amazing moments were not in the places that we originally thought they were. And the helideck being that one, it's the most tranquil place on the entire rig, and is a really, really special moment, and much more a sense of community up there. You know, people come there, and they come there multiple times, and they can spend a huge amount of time literally just sat on the amphitheatre, where we also have our own shipping forecast broadcast on the rig all day long, and that lovely sense of that British sense of humour, I suppose, that comes, and that kind of nostalgia of what the shipping forecast is. So that's where we are. That's where we are today. We're open now over a commission period until the 5th of November. But I suppose we also wanted to talk about this. That kind of stick that we were all beaten with at the start of the project and the festival of Brexit. And I think, for us, it kind of missed the point of what we were all trying to do. It was 10 very brave commissions, and I think it kind of goes to the heart of what Unboxed was, and sometimes was missed by the national press in the sense that we needed somebody who was super brave to take on a project like this, especially given the hard time we had, but Unboxed stood by us throughout the whole process. And that's almost what we want to talk about, that legacy piece afterwards. And yes, we did get some great national press, but it always led with that conversation. However, what we did notice is that the design press was very, very different. It didn't even come into the conversation. They spoke about what we wanted to speak about. They spoke about the design integrity, the artists that were involved. And that was the big difference for us, and it's where it started to lead. Same with the international press. It was much more about the design principle. I think that's a really interesting point, how you have the national point of view, which is led by the politics rather than the arts, whereas the design and the international were much more interested in this conversation. And for me, it really came to a head yesterday. We had 2 people fly in from the States. They'd seen it, they contacted, they heard about it. They came in yesterday, looked around it, and they have 3 sites in America where they now want to do this as a project. Never at one point did they talk about the politics of the project. They were just amazed about what we'd achieved, what the potential was with industrial structures. They'd already cited the fact that they have a problem in America where these rigs already exist, and they wanted to learn from our process, take our blueprint, and understand how they can now do that in the States over the next few years. In the same way, we have a client coming in from the Middle East in 2 weeks' time as well. They want to see if they could do a structure where the legs are still in the sea, where they do an underwater gallery by the legs and then a modern art gallery on the floors above it. And for me, that speaks to that word legacy. We are a short commission in terms of how long we're in Western and what we're doing, but the whole point was that we proved this. The whole point was it's an experiment in creativity. We did that experiment. It was harder than we expected, that's for sure, but we got there in the end. We have that sentiment now. We know what's possible, and someone has to be first. Being brave, being out there, you have to go first, and somebody has to do that, and that is hopefully what we've achieved with Sea Monster.